It's time now for your questions answered, and we've been asking you to send in your questions about the impact coronavirus has had on the events industry. Well, with us is events reporter for Campaign magazine, Fayola Douglas, and we're also joined by Maxwell Fellows, founder of Elevate Mentoring, which supports people working in the events industry. It's great to have you both with us, and we've got a lot of questions, so I'll get straight to it. James in Watford asks, first of all, what will the future be for major music and arts festivals? And James cites Glastonbury. It's obviously impossible to social distance at a music festival. I suppose that's the question, Fayola, is it?
I think with Glastonbury, because it is such a long-running festival and it does have fallow years where it takes a year off, it's highly likely Glastonbury will return better than ever. Maybe in 2021, that's what they're hoping. And we just have to really wait and see what happens from July, really, when smaller events can start to open up and how that progresses.
Max, James in Watford is saying, could tracing apps perhaps be used for 7 days before a big music or arts festival to determine whether attendees have been near someone that's been affected? Would that be one possible option, do you think?
I think there's going to be kind of many different ways in which to help bring back what would be the live events as we knew it before kind of to life. Track and trace is going to be one of the key ones. I think the biggest challenge is going to be with events such as Glastonbury or any sort of kind of arena event is going to be the sheer social distancing aspect. And so to try and bring those back to life, and with it the energy, the excitement and that kind of atmosphere that people go to these live events for, it's not going to be like that for at least the next year or so, with live events kind of looking to come back maybe in 21, but it's likely we're probably going to see it on a much smaller scale to start with.
That's interesting, Fiona. You're nodding. You agree that Max isn't being unduly pessimistic about that 2021 day. And also, I have to say to you, all right, it's all very well for a huge festival like Glastonbury, but there are obviously a lot of smaller festivals and indeed events going on indoors, aren't there?
I think with some of these events, it's not going to be possible to social distance in them. And so they're not actually going to return until we can be close to each other. Whereas with some smaller events, you can limit the capacity and make sure that people can stay apart. But I don't think that would be feasible for something like Glastonbury.
OK. Max, a question from Russell in Manchester here. Is it likely the government will carry on supporting staff working at venues, concert arenas, theatres, for example, if they don't return until 2021? Russell does make the point that the theatre and live music industry, the creative industries as a whole, contribute an enormous millions and millions to the UK economy, don't they?
Well, billions, in fact. And I think that's probably one of the biggest and gravest threats at the moment to the events industry as a whole, and that includes hospitality and leisure as well, is the fact that we've had furlough now extended to October. But at that point, and knowing the industry and having kind of taken polls and things like that, we know 60 to 70% don't believe until really Q1 that we're going to see some sort of return to events properly. So there's going to be a real kind of gap there where post-October, there's going to be potentially redundancies, and it's a grim and probably pessimistic outlook. But unfortunately, unless the government or there's greater initiatives taken, that's unfortunately what may well be the case.
And of course, so many different industries and so many different sectors of the economy are making a call on the public purse, aren't they? Bridget asks, and I'm not quite sure which one of you is best placed to answer this question, so do dive in. It's quite a specific one. Scotland was due to host the World Team Mounted Games competition this August. Now, this is a horse riding sort of competition, and they were expecting teams with horses to camp for a week in the Scottish borders, around 500 participants and support, staying in their own lorries, caravans and tents. What do you feel about the likelihood of that event being held in August? Max, perhaps first of all.
Yeah, I think many events and look, as a global nation, we want to get back, and I know myself personally as well, as striving to kind of see sport and competition resume as quickly as possible. We're seeing now golf coming back, cricket, rugby, football, but all behind closed doors. And so it's possible, perhaps with precautions, to play and to have these sports resume. But the biggest factor is that the audiences and those participants aren't going to be possible, or it won't be possible for them to participate. So things like that in terms of games and equestrian, horse riding is quite an isolated sport anyway. So I don't see really, with the proper precautions and necessary care taken, why that couldn't necessarily be brought back. Perhaps in terms of the accommodation and the kind of the arrangements around the fringes of the event might change, but the actual event itself might well be possible to do that under due care and attention.
OK, some possible good news for Bridget there. Fiola, I want to specifically ask you the next one. This is from Rob in London, who wants to know whether you think a lot of our smaller music venues will survive coronavirus.
I think this is something we've been talking about for the past few years. A lot of these smaller venues have been struggling. And so with the fact that they've had to be closed at summer, this is some of their busiest time when they're making a lot of their money that kind of ties them through the year. So it doesn't look positive unless the government can really offer them some support.
Oh, really? You agree, do you, Max?
Yeah, I think that's what we're going to see, and where the bigger circuits of your bigger concerts and festivals and things like that, they're just not going to be feasible, both from a promoter and a commercial value perspective. Artists are going to want to be earning a certain amount of monies, and I think we're going to see a really interesting shift here from that bigger arena style concert and events and things to much smaller, perhaps localized. And from a cultural perspective, I know that the younger, Jen said, and those audience and age groups are dying to get back into it, whereas the middle ages and perhaps slightly older are being a bit more cautious around it. So I think the first to come back will be those smaller, more boutique type music venues. And it might be that we see some of the bigger artists doing or kind of practicing and performing in those spaces as well.
This is a question from Rebecca from the BBC, i.e. me. What happens if you've already got tickets for an event, say over the summer, and you know it's been cancelled? Because it seems to me, certainly from my experience, everything is different. One event's giving you your money back, one event's giving you the chance to rebook your tickets, one event's saying we're giving you your money back but you can still have your tickets if it goes ahead next year. It seems very confusing to me. Fiola, what's your experience?
A lot of the festivals I have seen that they're offering people their money back, or they can have a ticket for next year. Because there is so much uncertainty, people might choose to take their money back and they can simply rebook when it comes to 2021. But if you're not able to get your money back and you can only go next year, I don't really think that that is fair. So if you've booked using your credit card, maybe that's a good way for you to be able to get your money back.
Max, just briefly.
Yeah, very quickly, just to add to that, where there are events where it has been postponed and there is an alternate date, it's been seen or shown that around 95% people are happy to hold on to that, showing both kind of commitment and loyalty to that event. Those that don't or can't make that alternate date is around 5%. Unfortunately, those that just cancel without the sight of when that's next going to happen are the ones that are in this kind of limbo where they're wanting a refund, but the organisers are telling them something's coming, but perhaps not just when. Agreeing with Fiona there is that absolutely they're due their refund if they're not able to make that, or if there isn't an alternative date. I know personally I'm in the same position as you, Rebecca, in that I've got monies tied up with events that haven't yet refunded and promised it. So it's going to be interesting to see, and again, maybe a government factor that they have to get involved to make sure from a consumer perspective that our rights are kind of upheld and refunds are given.
We have to say goodbye now to viewers on BBC World, but do stay with us if you're still watching in the UK. And we still have Fiola Douglas and Maxwell Fellows with us, answering your questions about events and festivals. A question again about sporting events. This is from Chris in Salford. When do you think mass participation running events will be given the go-ahead, Fiola? I suppose, I suspect what Chris is talking about there is perhaps marathons, half marathons, the Great North Run.
Yes, and I know that we've seen that the London Marathon has been postponed, and so they're hoping that's going to be taking place in October, but it could look very different from the normal marathon that we see. And I think one of the things we also need to think about is how the emergency services support these events, and if they're going to be put under strain by supporting these events. There's thousands of runners. There's usually 75,000 people who will attend to watch the races, and that just isn't necessarily going to be able to happen even in October.
Max, this is a question from Roxanne, who wants to know what will happen with the exhibition industry, which relies on large indoor gatherings. I suppose we might be talking about big, Christmas fairs or wedding fairs, for example. Roxanne says all of the UK halls are currently being used for temporary hospitals. How and when will this ever return back to normal?
I actually think that it will be one of the first kind of larger scale events to return to normal. I think we've seen with Nightingale, or NHS Nightingale, sorry, that it's actually now being put into a phase of standby, almost then in decommission, and so hasn't actually been fully utilised. So we've got these spaces becoming and will become available again, provided that everyone kind of adheres to government guidelines and the virus stops spreading. But I think given the way in which we could manage that, and it has been seen then in Asia as well, as almost similar to the shopping aspect where you have your one-way system. So I think actually it's one of those environments that can be very much regulated and controlled, and so would be one of those that we'd see perhaps back sooner than some of the other mass participation events.
Let's talk a little bit about sport, because Graham wants to know how can sporting events, Graham mentions football, but I guess you could argue with, tennis, any other spectator sports events. How can these sporting events observe social distancing, even if they're being played behind closed doors? Is that anything that you've thought about, Fiola?
I think specifically we've already seen in Germany that football is getting back underway, and players, they're not in touching each other where they can help, no handshakes after a goal, that kind of thing. But people are obviously going to be in close proximity, so not having a crowd there obviously is good for social distancing, but players on the pitch, that's just not necessarily possible. For other sports like golf, it's going to be a lot easier.
But what about rugby, Max? I mean, you can't socially distance playing rugby, can you?
No, unfortunately not. And I'm a rugby man as well, so can't wait to get it back, having seen the last series cut short. I think it's going to be around testing. It's going to be around being due diligent or doing those precautions, potentially even blood tests where necessary. But in terms of the track and trace piece around also seeing where there's been previous contact and things like that, it's going to be really kind of slow progress. It's going to have to be almost kind of drip fed back in. But I think it's through those testing and taking those precautions that we can minimise it. And then I think it's a kind of moral obligation from the clubs and where they feel whether they should be bringing people back to. I mean, rugby is probably the most contact sport, so I think that's going to be perhaps the last to come back. But yeah, I don't think there's a single fix at the moment.
That's on the field. What about off the field? Ronnie in Newcastle makes an interesting point, I think. I watch non-league football where there can be between 100 and, 1,000, but I mean, these are still very small crowds watching the games. Ronnie makes the point at most grounds there will be enough space for social distancing. What is the prospect, Max, perhaps for games going ahead with spectators attending next season?
In terms of when that actually does then happen, and I think to the latter part of this year, I think it's very viable. I think there's going to be an increase in staff, sanitisation, it's going to be staggered, there's going to be additional testing, there's going to be increased security. So again, with that is cost. And so I think a lot of these clubs are going to be looking at the cost of opening up versus actually playing it behind closed doors. But I think where you have you're probably talking 20% of what would be capacity actually utilised by fans. Then I think, again, it could be done, provided all the precautionary measures are taken. But I think that adds to queuing time, it adds to costs for clubs. The food and beverage piece will be almost completely eradicated. So again, that's a possible earnings for the club, which will now be gone. So it's going to be really interesting kind of seeing that weighed up versus the benefit.
Fiola, a final question for you, if I may. This is from Gary. It's quite a specific question, but I think it's got wider implications. Gary organises an annual event which takes place in Edinburgh each October, and he would like to know when festivals are likely to be allowed. He makes the point that the Prime Minister didn't include large gatherings in his roadmap, which leaves the festival and event industry in limbo and unable to plan accordingly and to know whether to go ahead or not? Of course, there are quite a few implications in that question, because we know the main Edinburgh festivals in August have been cancelled, don't we? And of course, there are different rules around lockdown in England and Scotland. But broadly speaking, Fayola, can you give Gary any reassurance?
I think there's a number of things to be considered. Is the event going to be largely indoor or outdoor? Because I think this is going to be one of the biggest things to consider in terms of numbers. But I think that these larger scale events, if it's going to be more than 500 people, I don't really think it's likely until 2021. So I don't know how many visitors his event is going to be drawing in, but it might not be happening. But it's difficult for him, I guess, when he's starting to think about cancellation, because he might not want to do that until we find out more in the beginning of July.
Yeah, understood. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Gary does say his event attracts 20,000 people over 7 days, just for your information. But Fayola Douglas and Maxwell Fellows, really great to talk to you both. Thanks so much for taking the time to answer all the questions. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.